So this paper was actually presented at the 12th Rural Entrepreneurship Conference in the United Kingdom. We were looking at rural entrepreneurship and rural development. It was a keynote address given at that conference. And what I was trying to look at was why in some regions have walnuts developed as a crop and other regions they've been much slower. And the three regions are ones which I've had a lot of involvement with over the past years, either consulting there or working there. So New Zealand around the South Island is one of the major areas, and then Australia, and then Guangxi province, which is in southern China. And you can see the areas look quite different between the MIA area. New Zealand and Tasmania look a bit the same, but Guangxi province in the tropics looks a fair bit different again. And just to give you a bit of an idea of what's happening with walnuts globally, if you look at world production, and then the red is Chinese production on the larger axis over here, you'll see that from about 2005, Chinese production has really been taking off in terms of walnut production. Australia, the three regions I'm looking at, New Zealand, Guangxi and Australia, are over on the right axis, which is considerably smaller amount of production. But you can see New Zealand is not really going anywhere. Australia and Guangxi have started to increase production considerably, but Guangxi is now well up here somewhere, but I just couldn't get any recent figures from Guangxi. But the estimate is around about 30,000 tonnes is the estimate for Guangxi now. But it depends a little bit on who you talk to, and sometimes in China they exaggerate a bit, so certainly up towards that level. But these were the last official figures I could come across. So why compare the three regions? Basically, in the 1990s, the three regions were very similar. So in Guangxi, in 1990, there's about 200 hectares. It's not a traditional walnut growing area in China. Australia is about 150 and New Zealand about 50. There are some differences. In Guangxi, it was less than 1 hectare was the average grower area. In Australia and in New Zealand, it was about 5 hectares or less than 5 hectares. So they're all, at that stage, small operations, very small area. There were certainly greater than 100-year-old trees. I've seen 100-year-old trees in all three regions. In the 1990s, there had become available for all three regions agronomic packages and varieties for production of walnuts in all three locations. So there was a full agronomic package available, how to grow walnuts, and these were being used in these areas. They all had varieties, Yunnan varieties for Guangxi, US varieties in Australia, and locally developed varieties in New Zealand. There was some research going on in all three locations. The difference then came when you start to look at 2013, about 30-odd thousand hectares, 3,000 hectares in Australia and 500 hectares in New Zealand. So from very similar starting points, very different end points in terms of the industry. Now, socially quite different regions, but they all had some production, all had growing packages, and the nature of the industry and the nature of government input has changed dramatically. So if you now go to the number of R&D staff in Guangxi is over 100 specialist walnut staff in the region. In Australia it's about 0.5, and in New Zealand it's about 0.25 is left in terms of government support. Government input, there are substantial direct subsidies in Guangxi for walnut growing and establishing a walnut orchard. There was some government input around managed investment schemes for walnuts, and a lot of the middle range production came through managed investment schemes, the sort of expansion from 700-800 odd hectares up to 2,500. There was a lot of that was MIS scheme. In New Zealand, you would never find a subsidy no matter how hard you look. There is no such thing as the concept of a government subsidy for agriculture left in New Zealand now. You're on your own. Huge difference in intensity in the processing and handling. There are hundreds of small processors and management. Every village processes its crop and handles it in Guangxi. In Australia, basically all of the 75% of the walnuts are handled by Walnuts Australia. In New Zealand, 75% of the nuts are handled by a single company that buys and shells and processes them. So you started out very similar, ended up very different spots, and obviously from an agricultural perspective point of view, you'd rather be expanding to a 30,000 hectare industry than the 500 hectare one. So looking at this expansion, the idea is what's important. You've got a whole range. You've got growing, processing, handling, marketing, quality determination, byproduct. So a whole lot of things are important. So if you look at the New Zealand situation, where it's at now, Jenny and Malcolm Lawrence run a cracker of a nut. They handle about 75% of the New Zealand crop. They produce an enormous number of different products. They produce walnut chutneys. They produce, have specialist mechanisms now for dealing with shell, and they have a buyer that uses the shell for paint stripping. They produce specialist walnut oils. They've got varietal products, organic products. They market throughout New Zealand. They average a little bit over twice the price for their product that you would get for quality imported walnuts. So a lot of emphasis on marketing, a lot of product diversification, a lot of entrepreneurship gone into this product. They crack, clean and package. They produce about 10% of the walnuts in New Zealand, and they market other people's for about 90% of the product. They do walnut pressing, and if you look at most of their sales are in New Zealand at various specialist locations, not at Coles and Woolworths and their equivalent, but at gourmet type food producers, specific restaurants and so on. They first compressed walnut oil in 98. They dealt with chefs in New Zealand, and this product here with some New Zealand red walnuts in it won the National Award for Food Excellence amongst chefs. They supplied the VIP Hospitality Lounge at the World Expo. They've got gold medals for their walnut oils and for a number of walnut oils, and they have, as I said, a range of products. So it's a real entrepreneurial activity, very high quality, very high returns per kilogram compared to others. There are other producers in New Zealand, small, sort of up to 50 hectares, and there's a nut zeno, which is a walnut liqueur, which is very nice, that's produced in New Zealand. There's the Walnut Growers Manual, there's organisations, there's processing equipment. These specialist products for dealing and handling with nuts are manufactured in New Zealand. An olive oil and walnut oil press is manufactured in New Zealand. So there's a lot of small-scale entrepreneurship around it, but the rate of development has been very slow. So if you look at New Zealand, there's a lack of external capital, and that lack of external capital means there's a shortage of numbers of growers. If there's as many growers in New Zealand as there were in China, then you'd have the same, much bigger production. Even if you increase by 100 times the number of growers, so that you've still got a relatively small nut, you'd be into 50,000 hectares. But there's lack of this external capital. But the growers that are involved have high levels of skills and capabilities. Most of them have got alternative income streams, so that they're actually using those alternative income streams to slowly use from income money to develop and they have a long-term time horizon in their thoughts. They're not worried about developing slowly. But because they're using their own money, there's a high emphasis on risk management. And so they're very slow in their development and very low level of risk. So they're maintaining off-farm income streams, which means they've only got a certain amount of time, certain amount of capital. and they prefer to invest in capital appreciating assets like land rather than ones that have risk associated like trees. And they scrounge. They're really good. One thing about New Zealanders is they scrounge things pretty well and get things done for nothing by me while I was at Lincoln University and so on. They have a very strong walnut industry group which is very well united, and they work very well together as a cooperative and collaborative organisations. So all the walnut growers, and they've developed very slowly, and they're mostly remaining small, but what they're not doing is going broke. So as a consequence, you've had a slow industry development. The situation in Australia is somewhat different. It is dominated by Walnuts Australia. Walnuts Australia took over VCon in 1996, and they'd planted 500 hectares. So up until VCon got involved, the Australian industry actually looked very similar to the walnut industry. Small players investing small amounts of capital until VCon came in and planted up 600 odd hectares over near Swansea. Then Webster's purchased them, and they expanded considerably with large plantings and managed investment schemes plantings with guns and Webster involvement up in New South Wales. So you got a lot of managed investment scheme capital got poured in and more corporate capital getting poured in. So you've got this substantial expansion, and in 2012 they actually did a major capital raising and raised 20 million on market capital for an expansion and development of a processing operation there. And they've got a shelling plant. They've also got a National Emerging Exporter of the Year award, National Winner for Agribusiness of the Export. So these are also a fairly market-driven, entrepreneurial, fairly high-tech, entrepreneurial, market-driven corporation. But they're operating at a different scale, and basically the different scale has come because there's two forms of investment. Originally VCon and Webster's and Guns put in their capital, and then they raised a lot of cash from managed investment schemes. They subsequently had major problems, but Webster's bought that whole scheme, but it was purchased as a large operational scheme, and then they went out to market and raised market capital from corporate capital. So there's been a shift now from an individual basis to a corporate capital raising. And as a consequence, they've managed to expand to this 3,000 hectare and have this sort of machinery operational. There is still this underlying group of walnut producers similar to the New Zealand small organisations, and so there's still a whole range of different operations. There's a walnut group that's quite strong, maintaining quality, and there used to be in Victoria a walnut development office who's since retired. So if you look at the Australian situation, the negatives are they've got corporate economic issues, the need to maintain capitals. They've lost the management investment scheme as an investment mechanism, but they've managed to replace it with direct corporate capital raising. But there's still this shortage of numbers. There's still only one company operating and not much else going on besides that. So you've got to a reasonable stage, but you have some positives here, a good vertically integrated, increasing second tier developments now going on. So there's some operations going in Victoria that are looking at hundreds of hectares of walnuts being planted, so that there's an expansion beyond that single corporate capital. They've got a good market, and they've got good chains, and now their risk premium investment is going down because it seems to be a successful industry. And the response has basically been for the first tier grower to get bigger and bigger so that they can operate globally, export and produce efficient thing. But their big thing is that they now have access to corporate and private capital to an extent much greater than in New Zealand. Guangxi, same sort of situation, development, experimental plantings in the 90s. But what happened in 99 is the government decided that economic development was needed for these hill regions of Guangxi province. So they started to build these development roads into the hills, and they started to provide subsidies for planting of walnuts in these areas in order to develop an economic industry for the producers there. About 231 per mu. A mu is a 15th of a hectare, and 6.1 about for $1. So not a huge subsidy by our standards, but by Chinese standards in these underdeveloped hill regions, a really strong impetus from the government to fund the planting and development of land for walnut growing. Alongside that was this huge Western development plan, basically building roads and infrastructure into these mountain regions, so if they grew the walnuts they had some mechanism to get the product out and get it to market and sell it. And a lot of demonstration orchards went in, supported by the local organisation. As I said, there was hundreds of on-the-ground extension workers here looking at teaching people how to do it. So the situation now is all of these villages in the hills will have maybe 20, 30 hectares, maybe a bit more of walnuts planted. They'll grow them up in high intensity. They'll grow mulberries, for instance, underneath and grow silkworms. So they're very intensive planting. So they're planting the walnuts quite intensively, but they're also managing the land and getting a return off the land from other things while they're doing it. There will be a village area such as this where you'll have extension workers operating from, where the subsidies for fertiliser and that come in through. So there's commercial plans being developed. So this was one, for instance, for 100 mu walnut planting in village 1, 8 and 9, and have dissemination. The villagers had to get the land ready, and then they'd be trained by the government how to do it, and the government would provide them with the fertilisers, the trees and everything to get going. So this was happening all across China, but it's still quite an energy intensive. A lot of the walnuts are grown on slopes, small single tree plantings. It's all hand-picked, hand-organised. This is a walnut tree in the background behind this house, so sometimes it might only be two or three trees for a single operation. Sometimes it's an entire village plants 300 to 600 mu out the back and manages it. It's interesting, that picture there shows all the walnut researchers in Australia plus all the walnut people in one small town in China. So I thought that was good, and I should only be a quarter of that, because only a quarter of my time is walnuts. So, and they've developed, this is a grafted pruning operation. They've developed some very unique methods where they can grow the trees up, prune them and have them ready in a single season, ready for planting out. And they've also small-scale entrepreneurs. So this is a little wood-fired drying plant that operates in one area and dries all the walnuts from 3 villages in order to produce a packaged product for walnut, which they can then market. So if you look in Guangxi, they have all the problems of a developing country: limited skill base, risk aversion, poor infrastructure, limited access to private capital. So these are the negatives. The big positive there has been considerable government support and a strong desire from the people to take up some sort of commercial activity that they can actually generate some income to get them out of just being a subsistence grower. A lot of labour, many farms, low capital need for each development, huge domestic market, and they reduce their risk premium by doing intercropping in the early stages, so that their risk is not as great. And you don't need to make a lot of profit to make it worthwhile. So there's been a rapid uptake by cooperatives there, extensive government inputs, everyone's still small, but once again they're not going broke, which is very important in this sort of a situation. And they've mostly got diverse income streams and extensive use of available labour. So we tried to look at this in terms of theories of entrepreneurial development, and I just realised I haven't got my watch on, but yeah, I'm on time. If you look at the New Zealand situation, and in fact, if you look all across, there's a high level of entrepreneurship being demonstrated, be it by small growers in China who've developed these wood-fired dryers, in Australia the MIS entrepreneur development in Guangxi. So entrepreneurship doesn't seem to have been a major problem in any of these regions in developing it. Infrastructure was to some degree lacking in all areas, more so in China. China seems to have got over it in Guangxi by massive government investment in infrastructure and then smaller investment by individuals. New Zealand and Australia obviously lacked infrastructure to start off with, but it developed in Australia with the corporate capital raising, and in New Zealand slow infrastructure development went on through cracker of a nut. Laws and regulations, not really a problem in Australia and New Zealand, and China in its development in recent times in Guangxi, really not a problem there to get going as well. This seems to be the really big issue in terms of what has led to development in one and not in the other, is financial support. Where has basically these are finance limited developments. All three of them have profitable industries selling a profitable product, but in New Zealand the capital base is very difficult to come by. You've really got to work hard to get capital in New Zealand, and it's very difficult to get it into a new industry away from some of the bigger industries that know what they're doing. It can happen, and in New Zealand other industries have managed to access capital. So if you look at Northern South Island, they grew from virtually no wine industry up to about 30,000 hectares over a very short space of time. So once it was felt that there was big profits to be made, then they could access corporate capital there and have a similar situation to Australia. In Australia, still a bit of a problem, but some access to corporate capital. In Guangxi, there's just been massive investment by government into these developments, so no lack of corporate investment. There's no social barriers in any of the area, no lack of training. All of this was done in the 90s. There are no training facilities or funds for training in New Zealand or Australia anymore, but the organisations have taken that over to some extent. In Guangxi, there's still government training. So there's still some lack of support services at the present time, would seem to be a major problem in New Zealand and Australia, not so in Guangxi, and there don't seem to be any marketing constraint. So in this particular development situation, it really seemed to be the development of capital. I did a more detailed analysis using a different mechanism, and we basically came up with the same issue here. In Guangxi, the real, in fact, if anything, Guangxi was the least entrepreneurial region of the three, which didn't go down very well at a conference on entrepreneurship and use of entrepreneurship for development of agricultural industries. Mostly here what entrepreneurship that was taking place was within the government, trying to get subsidies out of the government. The big difference once again was this lack of government input, and the expansion was much lower. The interesting thing is when you start to look at a range of other crops, you find that the same sort of developments can happen in different regions, just depending on where you are. So you've got three real industry types. The New Zealand type, which is a very slow development based on income. The Australian type, where you've managed to get a single corporate player in which has made some investment and got some money. Or the Guangxi type, where you've got a lot of small growers with a government support. And you can start to look at a whole lot of other industry developments. And if you look in Australia, macadamias seem to follow this sort of mechanism. There's several very large macadamia operations came into being and they developed the industry, and then you have the underlying groups. In New Zealand, there's a semi-dominant player, but it's a very small dominant player, not access to big corporate capital, just access to the private farm capital. Macadamia in Guangxi is actually developed in a developed area of China, and it's basically developed on the basis of a single large corporate entity developing it, very much like an Australian situation. And so you go on. In hazelnuts in Australia looks very much like New Zealand. Chestnuts in Australia very much like New Zealand. Pecans, a single corporate entity got it going. Eucalyptus trees for a single corporate entity got it going, namely guns down here. But there's some major issues, of course, with that going forward through their managed investment scheme. So I wouldn't promote that as a pyrethrum, a single corporate entity. Viticulture, some large corporate entities got going. In New Zealand as well, Montana as a corporate entity got going producing South Island viticulture. So New Zealand, where they can get cash, and a corporate entity, they seem to have this development, but a lot of their industries develop on those lines. In China, where they're in poorer regions, they tend to develop with this government subsidy and a lot of very small operations. Where you're in some of the more developed regions, you'll often get a big corporate entity come in. Now that might be a government owned enterprise, but very similar in external appearance to this Australian development. So just in summary, start off with very similar industry positions in the 90s, but you got to very different outcomes. 4 issues were identified: entrepreneurship, number of participants, capital availability and government input. All of these seem to be of major importance. In this particular case, there seemed to be entrepreneurship for everywhere, so it really was these ones. And what you found is, so high quality entrepreneurship and nothing else, you got quite slow growth in New Zealand. Where you had high quantity entrepreneurship and added some capital, you got moderate growth in Australia. Where you put high quality entrepreneurship together with some capital, plus government support, plus a large number of people ready, willing and able to take it up, then you got the most rapid growth of all. So I don't know what it means. It basically is an illustrative case study of at least one major industry and how it developed. It tends to throw some light on other case studies, but I think it's the sort of thing that you need to start to look at in terms of, well, how do we develop other industries? What should we be doing in other industries? What's likely to be the progression with other industries going forward? Okay. Yeah.
Thanks, David. Hi everyone, my name's Matt Wilson. I'm a PhD student here at UTAS. And I'm studying the development of Tasmannia lanceolata as an essential oils crop. And today I'm going to be talking about the plant nutrition side of that project. First of all, I'm going to introduce the species, Tasmannia lanceolata, then the principal component we're looking for in its essential oil or plant extract, polygodial. Then I'm going to talk through the methods of this particular project, my results and a few conclusions. So, Tasmannia lanceolata is a shrub. It's native to alpine areas of southeastern Australia, both the mainland and here in Tasmania. And it can very rarely grow as high as 6 metres in ideal conditions, but they're particularly old trees. It's certainly a very slow-growing species. It has distinctive red stems and small, very dark purple fruit that's almost black, pretty much is black. And it's, as I said, the distinctive stems, it's quite easy to identify. It doesn't look like many other Tasmanian or mainland species. And one of its positive attributes is its bush aroma, which is an important component of its appeal as an essential oil. It's usually regarded as an understory species and a shade-loving plant. Some of my other research is looking into the in fact, the role it really does thrive in the canopy and the light and temperature conditions it does particularly agree with. And so this is the plant. As you can see, the very dark fruit, the very green leaves, and those sorts of brownish, reddish stems that don't come terribly well under this overexposed slide, unfortunately. But anyway, the leaf material for the essential oils production is currently harvested from the wild, and this has problems both with consistency and also just with supply. With all plant extracts, consistency is something you're very much looking for, something you should be able to provide to the wholesalers who we're dealing with. And also there are some environmental concerns over wild harvest, both in terms of not being able to replenish native supplies, particularly more of fruit than of leaf. And so the industry has decided that it would prefer to move to a plantation production model, and that's a large part of what my project's involved with. Now on to the nutritional demands. Little is currently known. Some previous work has been done, particularly on nitrogen and phosphorus ratios, but this trial and another trial I'm doing hopes to extend that information knowledge quite extensively. And previous work did identify how important it was to establish these plants. I've done another trial involving different mulch types in the field, and it quickly became apparent that better understanding of nutrition was going to be essential to really have a strongly growing plantation model. And another feature of nutrition, though, with an essential oils crop is that it could influence the extract composition. And possibly, ideally, it could even allow for the preferential development of desirable components in that extract, such as polygodial. Polygodial is found in both lanceolata and other species within the Tasmannia family, or genus I should say, and within the Winteraceae family. It's also found in a Mediterranean sea mollusk. It's used in the food industry for flavouring, but also it's a marine anti-fouling agent. It has antimicrobial properties, antifungal properties. So it's quite a useful and actually very expensive compound. And polygodial is what gives lanceolata its unique and spicy flavour. So for my trial, I had 50 plants arranged in a Latin square design. So 2 plants per treatment area within a 5x5 trial. And Osmocote, which is a comprehensive fertiliser, including both the macronutrients and trace elements in small amounts, was added to the pots at 5 different rates, going from 4 grams up to 12 grams. 10 leaves were collected from each plant at the start of the trial, halfway through the trial and right at the end of the trial for nutrient analysis. And at the end of the trial, ground leaf material was extracted with hexane and analysed by gas chromatography to work out both polygodial and other component yields and composition. And so this is the trial right at the start. As you can see, quite uniform at this stage. Very few differences, hopefully. And this is a few weeks in, and you can already start to see that some of the trials, like the one up the back right there, was a 12-gram pot, and it's already experiencing greater plant growth. And by the end of the trial, you can see, for example, that one up the back right there has really gone through. And other ones, like this one further, it's a low nutrient level one on the bottom left here. It's fared nowhere near as well. So this is the plot of the growth, and as you can see, the 4 grams, the lowest treatment, has produced substantially less growth than the higher fertiliser rates. And that's something that's also reinforced here with the leaf number generated by each plant, that the 4 grams is vastly less than all the other treatments, though in this case the 10-gram treatment is just up there with the 12 grams, so there's no real difference observed between those 2 treatments, which indicates that that's probably already meeting the nutrition requirements for that level of growth. And the slight dip you can see in all treatments there is just where the leaves were taken for analysis. And this is the stem width, which just goes to reinforce the differences in growth. I mean, the thing to note here, though, is just that the 12-gram treatment was significantly less than the 10-gram treatment in this particular measurement. And this is what the nutrient levels, once they were commercially analysed, showed. It's probably worth noting that there's very few differences between treatments in terms of total phosphorus levels. But there's quite significant differences in the nitrogen levels between fertiliser treatments, and some differences within potassium, especially after the 40 weeks. It's probably just that phosphorus level is quite high by different species standards. A lot of other species, such as tomatoes, for example, do require around 0.4% phosphorus for ideal production, but many other species, you're looking at 0.2 or 0.3% is in the ideal range, and anything above that can even be toxic. So this is a chromatogram of the species of a essential oil extract, and so the C18, that's just the tracer I use to keep an eye on what's going on, and the red circles are the polygodial, so you can see just how dominant polygodial is within the profile of the essential oil. That's largely due to the selection of this particular clone. Only one clone was used in the trial, and it had been selected for its raised polygodial levels. And this goes to show the composition. And this, I hope you noticed that the 4 grams per pot treatment had significantly less growth than all the other treatments, but it was able to produce the most oil as a percentage of dry matter, significantly more than all the other treatments. The percentage of polygodial as total volatiles was consistent through all 5 fertiliser rates, but because of the greater yield achieved from the 4 grams treatments as a percentage of dry matter, it had greater total polygodial as a percentage of dry matter. This is probably going to be important for commercial use later on. So the greater gains in total oil yields at the lower fertiliser rate have to be balanced with the greater growth that was achieved at the higher rates. And so also other considerations have to be made, such as the greater weed pressure that would come from higher fertiliser rates. But the commercial analysis would have to be between the greater costs associated with extracting more leaf material to achieve the same amount of polygodial and other components, compared with the greater yields of plant material that could be obtained by raising fertiliser levels. And so future research could look both into the comparative costs, but also into how this might affect plants further down the road. I mean, this trial did last for 40 weeks and saw quite a big differential in growth rates, but we don't know what might happen later on in a future years in a field trial. And so finally I'd like to thank my industry partners Dean & Pepper and Essential Oils of Tasmania, Rurtic, for helping fund the project, and my 2 supervisors, Professor McNeil and Associate Professor Dougal Close. Thanks very much.